Hi, my name's May. I'm the co-founder of Virtual Peer, which is a group coaching platform supporting people with their career and leadership goals. And I also have a background in organizational design development and strategic change management. The talk that I presented was on burnout. So looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Thibaut?
Hello, I'm Thibaut. I'm from the UK. I work as a developer at Torchbox, the people behind the Wagtail CMS that you might have heard of. My main open source involvement these days is as a core developer to Wagtail and member of the accessibility team for Wagtail, and more recently being involved with Django's accessibility team. And yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Thibaut. Brian?
I'm Brian Douglas. I go by BDougie on GitHub, and that's my employer. I work at GitHub. My talk was about GitHub Actions and how you can leverage them in your Python projects. So I'm looking forward to hearing if you are using them, if you have questions, happy to field them. Also, I do chat with a lot of open source maintainers too as well and maintain my own projects. The one project, the big one that you probably haven't heard of is called Open Sourced. It's, yeah, pretty small.
Thank you, Brian. Juanita?
Hello, I'm Juanita. I'm based in Colombia. I am a developer for Spider IDE. I work for Quantsite. And last year, I've been doing docs work mainly and community work as well. I've been trying to come up with new ideas for Spider documentation to be better and more friendly, I guess.
Thank you, Juanita. And Melissa?
Hi, I'm Melissa. I am based in the south of Brazil. I've been working at Quantsite also with Juanita since the beginning of 2020, and I've been doing some work on NumPy on both documentation and some code, and also doing some community work for NumPy, which is what my talk was about.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all. Inessa, is there any questions? Or
I don't see any questions in the chat yet. And I
So,
strongly encourage our audience to get active and please ask questions.
So, Joik, in your talk, you told us you had to be a detective to solve one of the issues you presented while creating a specific release, right? So what kinds of tools do you use for that when you need to solve this kind of problem? I mean, how to solve these possible errors in the release when this happens? And I personally depend a lot on GitHub Actions or Travis for that kind of work. Is there something, some kind of walkthrough you would like to recommend?
Yeah, I just talk about my experience of like, I'm just a bit like stupid that, you know, sometimes like you panic, right? Like you'll be like, oh, it was working fine a moment ago. Why is now doesn't work? And especially when you're releasing and it's on a Friday night, you're like, you want to go out to meet your friends, have a drink, and then you're stuck there, right? I have to release it. And so yeah, I don't have a special tool. Like usually you can just see your trace. You know, if you look at the GitHub action or your Travis, like there's also the log. They see, oh, what went wrong, and then like, what does this error come from? And so yeah, like I think I was just overlooked because at that time the problem came from pip tools, which is actually one of my talks environment dependencies. So it's not exactly in my requirements doc text. So that's why I kind of overlook and like doesn't know what went wrong and try to like kind of go through loops of things. And I like also kind of, I was stupidly opening an issue on talks saying like, oh yeah, it's broken because of talks, but it's not. So and I was like, oh, sorry, I do love talks, don't be angry at me. And you know, but yeah, I don't know how is it an often thing? I don't know whether other maintainers can let me know that. Is it like something that you have experienced before that you kind of like, oh, why my CI is broken? It works on my computer, why it doesn't work on the on GitHub Action, you know? So
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's something I'd like to hear from Brian as well. So I'm terrible and afraid of dealing with GitHub Actions in that sense, you know. So these days we're helping a project specific to migrate stuff from a proprietary platform. Yes, that one, you know, the work helmet one, the mustache one. So to GitHub Actions, right? And there are lots of pain and suffering involved. And so do you have any tips on something that could help in the transition, and also on the choice stuff, on how can we navigate when we're trying forensics on GitHub Actions, for instance?
Yeah, so I would say that even GitHub ourselves, we took a while to migrate to Actions because we were using other services as well. So I guess to start off, I mean, I usually take like a small piece and start there. But let's say like in the context, I don't want to assume like Django, so maybe just say Python. Actions does have the ability to run stuff. It's a full-on VM. So you could leverage Docker as well if you wanted to. It doesn't get in the way if you're not using it or if you are using it. So if you're able to get your CI to run locally, leveraging Docker, that could get you as like a nice little step in the right direction. And I use Docker, replace Docker with something else. And I'm pretty sure that would be fine as well. But well, something else that does containers. So that could be a stepping stone for that. I've chatted with a couple different projects. I think the one that everybody that I could say out loud is the Rust project. And they had a lot of like infrastructure and stuff like that that was that was cumbersome to migrate. So it just really comes down to like, can you get it in some sort of container first, and then you're good to go? Or sorry, can you get it in a container first, and then you'll be good to go to transition. Now, I'm talking about the large projects. If you're a small project and you are just sort of, you point and click, added a travis.yaml file, for the most part, most of that transfers over because we leverage YAML as well. So there's a lot of great error messages in the actions logs that will hopefully point you in the right direction. We also have a community forum as well, which a lot of our open source maintainers leverage. And the PM team, the engineers, and the support team all circle the GitHub.community forum. So the best place to actually ask your questions, and it would be super helpful, is there. If not, at least ask it in Stack Overflow, and someone will find it and help you out.
Nice. Thank you, Brian. So any speakers on more options in GitHub Actions or opinions, forensics, so on?
I think there's a good question in the chat that says, is there any way to run GitHub Actions locally? And I've had a similar question because sometimes you don't want to have to keep like re-pushing your PR to get the action to trigger to see if like that's going to work that time. So I am also very curious about that.
Yeah, so my name on my Zoom is bdougie. If you went to youtube.com/bdougie, I've got 3 tips for debugging actions. It's a video to answer this question, so I can just point there in case I missed some steps. But I do the Docker way. If I could run it locally, I'll just run it locally and then see it run. If you, there's 2 other ways. Another way you could actually, there's a GitHub action called tmux actions. So if you needed to jump into the action runner that's hosted on GitHub and see exactly what's happening, you can do that. Just open up a shell. Another way is there's another tool called ACT. The GitHub handle is Nectos. Anyway, the video points to it. There's a link. From there, there's that tool, and you could run anything that runs on pull request or push on demand. So instead of pushing a commit, you can debug that way. I mentioned there's a lot of different ways. So sorry, the debugging story in actions is not as clean. It's something that we've been working on. We've been researching and chatting with open source maintainers about. You could also manually run workflows. So I have a bunch of actions that run whenever I cut a new release. I don't want to cut a new release if it fails. So I actually have a webhook that's called the workflow dispatch that I add to all my actions, that I can just manually hit the button in my action logs, and it just reruns the entire thing again with a clean cache too as well. It starts from fresh. Finally, I just want to mention one thing. Sorry, I just happen to work with this feature a lot. The CLI.github.com, you can now run actions locally from your machine, as well as watch the logs locally from your machine, and then step into the other things I mentioned locally from the machine that the infrastructure you're working from. So in case you happen to be tmuxing in other places.
Nice. Thank you, Brian. Anyone else? Any more questions on that line? Okay, so Rose, I'm a very slow learner, and these days I'm learning through someone else's code. So I really like your ideas on how to prepare these better informative commits, you know? So I feel I'm kind of do some of that already because of other experiences, but let me pick your brain on two things. First, how do you find the balance between a commit message that's incomplete, missing information, and a message that's more like an odyssey than anything, you know? And also, how can we ask that from our contributors without scaring them away? Because is this something that we could implement gradually, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think gradually is kind of the only way to go, because especially if these are not requirements that you already have in your, that your contributors expect of your project, then you kind of have to ease into it. So how to find the balance between not scaring off your contributors and wanting to still have enough information in the commit message. As maintainers, I feel like part of the responsibility you'll be carrying a little bit more of the weight at first. So for example, in our project Turn, I co-maintain it with one other person. We will, if we see somebody, especially who's new to the project, and we say, they open a pull request and it doesn't maybe have as much information as we'd like. Two things that I would suggest. One, I mentioned this in the talk, but having those requirements for your commit messages laid out. So you can have some examples of like what you'd like a pull request to look like, just, or what a commit message to look like just in terms of format. Maybe like we capped the title at 50 characters and then the body at 72. So just stuff like that. But then also sometimes we'll maybe say, hey, like, could you reformat your commit message to look, you know, in accordance with these standards? And if it's been more than, if they come back and they try to do that and maybe it's still not totally what we'd like, sometimes I'll just write the commit message for them and say, like, you know, could you use this? And some of that work, that is putting more work on the maintainers, but it's also a good place to kind of set an example and also take some of the burden off of especially first-time contributors who maybe don't want to keep iterating through to get the perfect commit message. So, and then it's also just shows them how, you know, in the future, like, gives them an idea of what you're looking for. So it's kind of was a two-part answer, but hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, Rose. So any more questions or experiences from the speakers on how to deal with nice commits? How do you receive nicer commits for your projects?
When you say how do you receive nice commits, you mean how to encourage better commits?
Yeah, let's go that way. So how do you help your contributors to write better commits for you or for the project in the future?
I think at least for Wagtail, what tends to really help is to be very clear on issues that if you expect people to have some sort of plan ahead of making the commits, they reach out to you, because then you get to actually talk them through the whole thing, and they are just much more likely to have a better experience if they can already talk to you before they actually write any code. It helps their onboarding quite a bit, and yeah, it's just much clearer for them what to do, exactly what you're expecting, I think.
Mm-hmm. So how what kinds of tools do you use for these maintainers? How are there any tools that could be used to automate these commit messages standardization, you know, like a commit message linter? Is there something like that we could use?
Yeah, I think there are lots of tools out there. We actually wrote just a custom like specification that just does a quick check on the commit, but I know Gitlint is another project. And I'd be curious what other maintainers use to enforce those commit message standards as well.
I want to also point out, so this is part of a larger item of, in general, how do you include and teach and encourage volunteers whose contributions aren't where you want them to be, right? I wrote a blog post with several suggestions about how to do this, divided into a few different sections. There's teaching people to improve their code and their software engineering practices. There's dealing with the poor contributions themselves. And then there's sort of redirecting them, right? In some cases, it might be best to use those contributors' knowledge and curiosity to improve the project in other ways. So I've put a link to that in the chat in case people want some of those other alternative approaches.
Thank you, Sumana.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love that. I'm gonna read this blog post and this list of things. I actually was encouraged when I was chatting with the Pandas project. They had an issue where it's the other end of the contribution, where they just have a lot of issues, and it's very hard to know who's working on what and how you can get started. And they do have a guide, but sometimes people don't read the guide. So they actually I'll drop in the chat. They actually leverage a GitHub action. Sorry, this is what I love talking about, to basically allow people to assign themselves to issues. And then they have another script to basically go through and check on folks to see if they need any help. So it just leaves a comment, kind of like Stalebot, but not Stalebot where it closes the issue. It's sort of like prod bot. I don't know what they call it, but basically like, hey, are you okay? Do you need any help and stuff like that? And that sort of gets the conversation started. And then just continue to redirect people to an issue. So if you want to work on something, open the issue first, and then assign yourself to the issue. And then they can sort of like do the triaging through helpful with bots and stuff like that.
Nice. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. So more questions on that? More input on that, speakers?
I think it might sound a bit old-fashioned, but to me, there's not much that can beat talking to people directly. Unfortunately, that's still like the thing that works the best. If you have the time, if you can put the time in, like do just make sure to create those connections with people, whether that's some kind of event you're running now and then, whether that's a Slack workspace, and make sure that, yeah, they have a way to reach out to you directly, and you have a way to actually spend time with them. It's what pays the most in my experience.
Thibaut, I noticed that you use the word unfortunately.
It's just, as developers, we all love to automate things. It's just one of those things that.
Hold on. So I primarily do not ID as a developer, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why it's really useful to have maintainers whose first response is not about automating things. That's why complementary skills can be really helpful, right? If you like developers very often, right, seeing any kind of problem, think, how can I code my way out of this? And often, hey, that's helpful. That's very beneficial. But also it's extremely useful to bring in maintainers who the first question is, well, how do we solve this? And then part of it might be people, might be process. And then if there's a problem that needs coding, possibly delegating that, right?
Yeah, and I think the automation portion of like the commit message checking, like automating the actual check makes sense. But then, as you mentioned, that communication on like, how can we improve the commit message or how can we make this better next time is definitely something that works better in a conversation. You're not just going to send like an automated comment saying like, this needs updating, but like really taking the time to make it. And not only does it make like your project better, but it also makes them better contributors to other projects, which improves like the whole open source ecosystem. So having those conversations is important for everybody and benefits everybody.
It is. I also want to say first, hey, Thibaut, I'm about to be switching my site to a Wagtail site. So thank you for that. But also, I also get why another aspect of the like, unfortunately, is just the sheer time commitment. And because there is an issue, just as you said, like if you have the time to have these conversations, and Rose is absolutely right that this is an investment in people, not just as contributors to your project, but to the entire industry. But I mean, I'm not getting paid by the entire industry, and in many cases many of us are not getting paid at all, right? This is where bringing in more co-leaders and actually sustaining them with resources such as payment for their labor is part of the how we actually can sustain both the code work and the people work and the process work, right, necessary for all of this. So I just wanted to, sorry, I realized that it may have seemed like I jumped on you like some kind of jerk YouTube commenter, like, hey, you said one word that I'm going to disagree with and now I'm going to dunk on you for points. That is not what I meant, and I'm sorry about that.
Don't worry about this at all. It's definitely my preference as well to favor those kinds of direct interactions. What Whitetail does is running sprints online or in person, things like Google Summer of Code as well. And I guess fostering those relationships, that's definitely my preference. There is plenty of room for automations as well. And GitHub does things like templates when you respond to issues. So there is a place for this as well, but small place.
I have a question regarding templates, because saved replies are so helpful, right? Hey, Mr. Dougie, is there, sorry, I just want to call you by,
Mr. Dougie's my dad, but yes, I'll answer that.
Is there a way to share saved replies with another contributor?
That is a great question. And as of today, not yet. And I use that term yet because like this is a feedback that I've heard already. I use save replies very heavily. And I love that I could respond, especially during Hacktoberfest. Like there's like some patterns you see in some newcomers, which is why I love the assign action. But also I love the fact that like my project, it's a small project, but it has a Discord. And I just, whenever you open up an issue or you open up a PR, you get an auto message because I can't see everything that opens up all 24 hours a day. But it just points you to Discord. And it's like, if you want instant like communication, like this, say hello in this channel, and I'll jump in there and say, okay, looks good. Maybe this, maybe that, maybe like flip this around. And you can have that conversation, not in the comments of the issue or the PR, because sometimes it's awkward to basically have that conversation happen in the open once your first time. And I don't want folks to feel like they did the wrong thing and now walking away, because I'd say that I've been doing this 9 years at programming professionally, and I've had interactions with projects where like there's a pre-commit hook that I didn't know what those were a thing when I first saw them, and I'm like, what is this? Like, I don't know how to get out of this. Like, so I'm just going to walk away and never look at this project ever again because I'm too embarrassed to know how to get out of this pre-commit hook.
Yeah, I would like to add the Discord server is really a good idea because you can do like kind of pairing that, like if someone really struggling and you see that, oh, they're really trying, then if you really want to offer the help, you can kind of like, oh, let's arrange a section that we kind of share the screen and I can have a look and all this. So I think it's really good. I really like using Discord.
Yeah, and I just want to say that was a real life example too. I literally could not get out of the pre-commit hook, walked away from a project that I could have contributed to.
Yeah, just I put all of my saved replies in gists and share them with other team members. So it's not ideal, but it does get you where you need to go.
Yeah, I just shared in the chat that we just did this for NumPy as well. I know there are other projects too, because we have actually copied some of the messages from other projects, but it's the same idea of saved replies, and it just saves you time and lets you communicate with people more effectively.
Yeah, so Sumana touched on the financial point, and I have a question just for that, but we will lose like hours in this. So let me go for Thibaut first. So Thibaut, you talked about accessibility in Python packages, right? And you said you checked 1,000 packages on PyPI to see how they're doing about accessibility, right?
Go on.
So could you share some of the most absurd, difficult things you saw? Without names, please, of course. And also, let me go there also. also suppose I want to start improving the accessibility of my project ASAP, but my team is small and we don't have that many resources. What do you think that could bring us the best effort to result ratio in the first moment? So where should we start, in your opinion?
That's a lot to unpack. I'll do my best. I didn't literally review the 1,000 packages. I just reviewed the list and then tried to think which of them basically might have issues. And the problem with accessibility, it can be quite taxing because it's a field where there are standards, but they aren't that commonly followed to the letter, which means that you're likely going to spend quite a bit of time reviewing things that don't meet those standards. So you have to be somewhat positive about this and, suggest improvements rather than, look at the mistakes, I guess. So in the Python ecosystem in particular, there are lots of people in the data science community that do tremendous amounts of teaching. And I think one thing I would suggest is just thinking of how those teaching resources that might not even be the project, but the resources around the project, making sure people can consume these as easily as possible. It's honestly things that might seem very simple, like just having multiple formats for a given resource, having something that's a video also as a document, having something that's a PDF also as a text files. It can be as basic as this. Coming back to where I spend most of my time, web development, I would say that there can be some misconception with developers that accessibility issues, you can find them with automated tools only. That isn't the case, but still there are plenty of automated tools that will take you to the 30% to 50% of issues found. So if you work on a web project, that's definitely the first port of call. And I can recommend in particular, there is one tool called Accessibility Insights. It's open source, built by Microsoft, and it extends another accessibility checker that's called Axe. That's quite well known. And so this one tool, Accessibility Insights, that's a browser extension in Chrome. And if you just install that in your browser, then you have access to both automated checks and manual checks that are basically as comprehensive as an expert could get to, or as basic as something you can have with a single click. So this is by far the best thing to start with.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours. So,
so Melissa.
Yeah, I just have a question about those, the tool that you were mentioning. Do they have actual people doing these tests? Do you have a group of people testing for accessibility issues? Because that's like you said, the automated tools will take you so far, but then you have to, to get the fine points, it would be nice to have actual people checking them. So I don't know if do you have ideas on that?
Yes, that's honestly still really hard because as you start talking about manual tests, it does require a fair amount of expertise. It's basically just like code review on a project. You do need to know the project quite well to make sense of it. So accessibility is the same thing. So I think I should start with the gold standard of this would be to involve people who actually have the access needs, who have disabilities, getting them onboarded with your projects. And it's honestly really hard to find those people. We have lots of diversity and inclusion issues in our field. So I'd say whatever you can do towards reaching out to those people is the first thing I would try. Then if you can't reach out to those people for whatever reason, what works is just reaching out to people who are experts in that field and asking them to do some of those audits with you. So in the case of Wagtail and Django, for example, we do part of the auditing automatically with the tools I had mentioned before. And then we have people like me who go through all of the pages of the Wagtail admin one by one and report issues back to people. Yeah, it's a fair amount of work, but it can happen.
Mm-hmm. So Jürgen is asking if most open source projects only have a GitHub and a PyPI page. Is there anything to do regarding accessibility?
That's a great question. I think I would start with the README, which is probably the most important document that each and every open source project has. Your README likely contains images. Your README might also link to things like videos. Might have lots of very few links. Just reviewing these through some of the guidelines that are out there for accessibility will definitely go quite a long way. I don't know how accessible GitHub itself is in particular, but I do know there are quite a few things you can do even in Markdown that would make people's lives better. One thing that's honestly is relevant everywhere in the world is providing alt text whenever you have visuals. So that's both in the README, that's both in your PyPI description. That's even the case if you share an image in Slack. Always make sure that there is an alt text with that. I hope that helps.
Mm-hmm. So Brian, any thoughts on GitHub and accessibility?
So as like right now, actively, we're going through an entire accessibility audit of all of GitHub owned properties. And right now I have stuff on my plate I have to fix because of that. So hopefully in the next month, GitHub will have an announcement or a blog post that says, hey, we did it. Everything's accessible. Today, obviously not the case. Well, sorry, not obvious, but the question came up. The answer is not the case every part of GitHub, especially like your repos and stuff like that. But I just echo what Debode said, which is like make sure stuff that's in your Markdown files, if it's in there, it's readable, it's supposed to encourage people to contribute or navigate. Make sure you have alt tags. Make sure you have stuff that like make sure you use headers and stuff too as well, so that way stuff can be tabbed through. Sometimes we can just put in a big blob of text, but break stuff up so it's accessible through readers.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thank you. More considerations about accessibility in your projects? Devs, Juanita? How's Spider in the sense?
Well, we recently actually tried to have a more accessible interface. We were working with a UI designer, and she was helping us to make it a bit more accessible in terms of like the sizes of icons and buttons and stuff. And the other thing that I am concerned about, and I'm been like trying to push a lot on this side, is translations. So for Spider, we have we use crowding for translators, or we already have like several languages for the interface, but I'm trying to do that as well for documentation. So that's the other side I'm pushing towards, but we are gonna still keep working with the UI designer to keep going towards accessibility on the interface, and I hope to do a good job on documentation as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks you all. Since I'm with Juanita already. So Juanita, you discussed your ideas on how to write more attractive documentation, right? How to generate better content for different groups and mainly a newer generation. Your ideas are already being implemented on Spider, and I'd like to know, how is this material being received and used? And I personally love it. And also, are there any ideas on how to convince more old-minded developers that this approach is indeed useful, fruitful?
Well, so on the side of Spider, I've the work is started basically with videos, like YouTube videos it was like tutorials on how to use several things on Spider, and I included these videos on the docs page, so people right now can watch the video inside the docs page. And they already, like, the most watched video has like 36,000 views, which I think it's a lot. And I think they're all like coming from the docs page. I don't think people are going to our YouTube channel because we don't have a lot of subscribers, but having this material embedded in documentation has been really good for people like to use it. We've received a lot of like good comments on the YouTube channel, and even in the issue tracker, sometimes we like reference some of the videos that we have, like when people are like having trouble, and they like we've had a lot of good responses from people saying like, yeah, this is great. And also I'm trying to make them fun so that they're like better to watch, which I think it's also good received by the community. I think that in terms to convince other out-minded maintainers, I would say that this is just like something extra from the material that everyone should be like doing, right? Like, I'm not saying you should only do videos, you should only do fun material. I think a lot of other people could just stick to PDFs or manuals or like reading content. I think a lot of people still enjoy that and are like better at doing that. But this is just a way of providing more resources for different kinds of people. And I think it's a good way to have like more accessible resources in that sense. So in terms of accessibility, I think it's also good to have different kinds of content. So yeah, let's go millennial.
Thank you, Anita. So any more experiences on documentation, on how to improve documentation in that sense, speakers?
I would just say that we take a lot of input from our contributors. So sometimes we actually just yesterday, I worked on an issue where a contributor was like, it would be really nice if you had a section that explained this. And working on a tool, we didn't even think about that because it's just second nature to us to like, we don't need that explanation. But, you know, really creating a community where contributors are encouraged to ask for what they need is what has helped us improve our documentation a lot as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rose.
I'd like to add also that one of the things that I was working on was a community survey. And on that side, I agree on with Rose in that it's really good to have the input from people asking for things. And in the survey, I realized that there's a lot of people that don't know about some characteristics that Spider has. And it's just like, probably it's because it's not in the docs or it's not like somewhere that people can be aware of this. So I think having the input from people, it's also a good thing for having the right information in docs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so thanks you all. So since we're going towards documentation and new users, Melissa, so first of all, let me tell you that I know the NumPy Newcomers project, and one may say that I know it from the inside now. And I think that the community effort that you and the others are doing there is commendable. So since NumPy is the north of scientific packages in Python, lots of stuff that you're doing there will be useful for us in other packages. So thank you for that. Now, let me ask you, NumPy is this large, mature package already, right? So that can be really scary for newcomers. In your experience, what's the barrier for people to start contributing and then continue in the long term? And I'd like to hear Juanita's opinions on that as well. How is it going with Spider? Melissa?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And so I can only speak from my own experience because I don't exactly know the details for everyone else. But I think just to share, the code base is huge. And the other day we were talking about this at a community meeting, and I mentioned like, oh, I don't know about that because I don't know that part of the code base. And I actually don't know all the parts of the code base. And then someone said, oh, nobody does. I mean, it's impossible to know everything from NumPy. So you were talking about documentation and I was thinking about the translations. And this is something that we have been discussing because we have started on the translations for our website, but not for the documentation. So the NumPy documentation, if you print it out, it's like 1,500 pages. So it's huge. There's no way we can get the translations on that unless we have like a huge number of contributors able to translate, review, and make sure that things are good. Yeah, and the CPython documentation is huge, and the Brazilian Python community has done an excellent job of translating the documentation. So it is possible, but you need like the translations group for CPython in Brazil. We have a Telegram group with over 200 people. So that's what it takes, I guess, to get the translations going. And yeah, so I think it's hard just because it's so huge, NumPy. Also because many people who look for Python packages to contribute to, they want to contribute in Python. And some of the code in NumPy is actually written in C. And so you have to understand the internals, you have to understand some of the templates, you have to, you know, it's a bit more technical. But at the same time, I think we are trying to put some effort into mentoring, into getting newcomers used to the issue tracker. We know that it's hard for a new user to come to GitHub and ask questions or say something and they think they might be wrong, or they think, you know, like, oh, my mistake is going to be immortalized in the NumPy GitHub issue tracker. And those are high barriers. So I think the newcomers meeting was also a way of getting people to know the ones behind the GitHub handles that they were interacting with. Because it's weird when you see a comment from XYZ on GitHub, they might be criticizing you and you might feel super scared. But if you know that person, you've seen them beforehand, it's so much easier to interact. So that's kind of the idea behind the newcomers meeting.
Thank you, Melissa. Juanita?
So in a side of a spider, we don't really have a lot of people like submitting PRs or like wanting to contribute actively. What I try to do, and like what the team tries to do mainly, is just sometimes there's like people that report issues that are like bugs that they find in something, and sometimes we're like, oh, you can try to fix it, and we can try like to help them, like you can go to this line and maybe this is the error and you can try debugging. And like we try to help people to solve their own issues sometimes, and that works, and people open their own PRs, but we don't really have like a lot of people trying to contribute. I'm still trying to figure out ideas for that. I made a video recently, I'm gonna send the link, on like encouraging people to contribute, not only to Spider, but to every like open source project. But I think it's just, sometimes it's a bit intimidating at first, especially with larger projects. So I think getting resources for people to like find it easier and maybe less intimidating, it's important for us to get like new contributors that have the talent and the interests, but are like maybe too intimidated or too afraid of like the process, because it's maybe too complicated at first. I don't know. So I've been trying to come up with ideas to make this easier for people, but we don't really have a lot of contributors like in Spider wanting to submit PRs.
Thank you, Juanita. Yeah, so in order to ask a question to everyone, this should come with a trigger warning, okay? So I think the hairier questions come now. And May, so trigger warning for burnout right now. So May, your talk showed what the effects of burnout can be and the stages one can reach when burned out. Of course, your talk is not to diagnose anyone, but I'll speak frankly, I identified myself a lot. I identified lots of my community a lot. And I know personally, I'm really burned out for a while already. So let me ask you, what are your experiences helping people that are apathetic already, and how they can start getting back to feel joy in their projects, in their work?
That's a tough one, Alex. The coach in me wants to ask you, what are you doing now to help you? But that's probably you want to hear from me. I don't want to open it up to you. It's quite a vulnerable place. Thank you for being so candid and honest. Yeah, it's tricky, and you know, I think having experienced it myself, I think the thing that I found, and you know, people that I've worked with have found, is actually taking a break and taking some time to really just nurture yourself and pursue a totally different interest if it's possible. I know in my presentation I talk about boundaries. I'm not so sure that works at a time when you're actually really in it. It's very difficult to establish. But what I would say is that it's more about amplifying other areas of your life. So rather than trying to compartmentalize things and be much more structured, it does help. It depends on your sort of personality and what you're feeling in the moment. But I think it's more about helping yourself amplify other interests, so that the work that you're doing that's creating that situation where you're feeling burned out, you're able to step away and step back from it without feeling like you're cutting yourself off. It's actually just refocusing your energy and your emotion into a different space, if that makes sense. It depends. I can only say it really depends. I think when, for some people, if it is really completely, I used to see this like where I coach teachers, for example, and I used to be a teacher myself. In fact, that's where I experienced burnout. But for some people, if they don't step back and if they don't find another way to nurture themselves, you become dead wood in the system. And deadwood's a really, I think, quite a powerful metaphor. It's like when I think about the education environment, people are there just to, I don't know, because they have no other, they feel trapped. They don't know what else they're going to do. They have no other identity, or they have no other way of seeing how they can, do anything different. And therefore their contribution and the impact and the value that they bring diminishes. And in fact, actually, the way in which you're perceived as a role model also diminishes. So I don't know, does that kind of help answer your question there?
It does.
We can take it
Thank you,
offline,
May.
Alex. I know it's always a tricky one, burnout. But yeah. And then one thing I wanted to say, actually, Simona mentioned before, is there anything missing from my talk? And I would say that actually it's one of those, burnout is one of those things that can creep up on you, actually. And you get caught up into a vicious cycle. And so even though I presented 6 steps, it's actually the steps 2, 3, and 4 that repeat over and over and over again. And that's like feeling anxious, feeling frustrated, then getting angry, okay? And you get angry with yourself, not just with others. And then you find a way to put the lid on it, and then you cope for a little bit longer, then the anxiety, the frustration. And so it's like you're in that loop for a very long time. And then, it's when you start to feel disconnected and alienated from what you do, that's when actually it starts to feel, it's almost a little bit too late, really. You really have to then just basically step right away and divorce yourself from a situation that actually is now becoming quite toxic.
Thank you, May. So we are almost blowing our time. I will ask permission from Inessa to do a last question.
Well, we can get, if everybody is happy with, the speakers, we can go over time. We have another 30 minutes.
And now the community will see that worse for me than burnout is discussing money. So, Sumana.
Hiya.
You discussed some great hypotheses for the leadership gap we have in open source currently. I'd like to add one more for your consideration, the lack of funding. And then I will hear this, oh, of course, Alex, right? So I think several developers and therefore leaders are going elsewhere, abandoning their projects, losing interest, due to the necessity of making enough to live, right? So then a company comes and offers them a job with no relation to that project, and the project itself loses in the process. So what do you think about that? And what are you seeing in that sense?
Thanks for the question. So just, I recognize that there are a lot of people attending this Q&A. Not everybody got to watch all the talks. So I'll mention that I shared a few hypotheses about how it could be, why it could be that we have a gap in how many leaders and maintainers we have in open source. And I think we don't have enough of a pipeline of leaders and maintainers so that we can help have some replacements so that people can pass the baton on. One of them had to do with tooling. One of them had to do with new problems, like what got us here won't get us there. Another had to do with culture and values. And then I did mention corporate involvement as one of these, that it changes things, that sometimes companies hire some people who have managerial skills and maybe take them out of open source work entirely. That is something that I mentioned briefly. So money is an aspect of this. I think there was a second part of your question, which is maybe what do we do about it? Is that right?
What are you seeing we can do about it, and your experiences on that?
Sure. There's a few things. One is that people who get hired right now, it's an amazing market for technologists. Like, I'm hearing and seeing that at least in the United States, people who are getting hired have the ability to negotiate a lot in terms of salary. One of the things that you can negotiate is, I would like to continue to work on open source, and get it in writing, get it in your offer letter that some percentage of the time, you're working on open source projects. So that's one thing you can do. And the moment that you're getting that new job is a really important moment. That's the moment you hold a lot of power, and you can say, these are things that I want, money, professional development time, and things like, I want N% of my time, I want to be working on open source. If it's in your contract, then you can hold on to that, even when managers say, well, we want you to do this proprietary work for the company. So that's a part of this kind of solution. Another is that I think, and I talked about this a little bit in both my maintainer summit talk and also my training. There was an education and training summit as well at this PyCon. I talked about this in this talk as well, that if we don't have enough of a pipeline of people with these leadership skills, let's build one. Let's grow more of those people, right? So that's something that we can do a little bit of work on as volunteers. It's also something that, if the open source industry as a whole benefits from there being maintainers, benefits from more maintainers happening, then it would make sense for GitHub, Red Hat, now an IBM company, right? All these companies to actually invest in mentorship and training and apprenticeship programs. Similar, we're seeing that, for more than 10 years, we've seen Google Summer of Code and Outreachy help with the intake. GSOC just does code, right? They have refused, right, to try and move beyond code. Then they added Season of Docs recently. Outreachy, for the past many years, has instead said, well, a lot of different contributions are welcome, right? If you want to learn to be a maintainer, a marketer, a designer, a translator, and so on, those are all things we're going to help with, to have apprentices, give them a stipend so that they can learn to be open source contributors with that skill set. We're seeing some leadership programs. We saw that Mozilla's leadership program has now gotten, I want to say copied, but in a good way, right? Like, there's many different iterations of it in lots of places. In the open science world, we're seeing that the science, open science facilitators, open science community coordinator, there is at least one program, if not multiple programs, that people are going through every year to learn how to be community coordinators of open source projects, specifically, or open science projects, I should say. So there's a few of these things. What I would like to see is some substantial funding and support for projects like the one that I am working on, right, to help grow more leaders, so that all right, industry is going to hire some number of them, but it won't leave as much of a gap if we have more of those people around. I think I don't know yet, like the numbers of this, right? These are hypotheses. One reason I did this talk was to say, hey, people should let me know if I'm wrong. People, please let me know if, nope, none of these numbers make sense. And I tried to share some ways that people could check if any of these hypotheses actually make sense.
So, Sumada, can I just ask, is funding, it sounds like funding's ad hoc, or are you, I mean, I'm not an insider, I'm not a coder, unfortunately. I wish I was, but my sense is that things in the open source community happen organically, and that's the wonderful thing about it, right? It's just so creative and so rich and complex, and out of that chaos becomes, something really beautiful that people create. However, and this was really apparent when I was doing the research for the presentation on burnout, funding was one area that didn't seem to get a lot of focus, yet it's a really big factor and could help with so many environmental, triggers in terms of what you talk about: resourcing, recognition, the whole reward aspect, development. So I'm just wondering I don't know, but is there a little bit more of a formal way that people can approach the whole funding aspect?
Yes. So because of a number of these issues that people have been talking about for definitely a few years now, I co-founded a working group under the auspices of the Python Software Foundation called the Project Funding Working Group. And you can think of a lot of different categories of open source as existing, some of which make sense to fund by a single business, right? And so you look at, for instance, GitHub itself makes some open source projects that it produces that are open source, right? The core platform is proprietary, which is not great, and which locks us in, much of the community, into a vendor that, is privately owned and that we don't have a voice in. So that's not great. But a number of GitHub's projects are open source. So that's sort of a category of project, right? Then there's categories of project that, one or two or very few people care about, and they work on as volunteers. There are categories of project where a number of different businesses sort of are in a consortium to work on things together. There are things that are much more about academia. Maybe there's an academic consortium or just one academic department. So there's all these different categories of open source, right? And these different categories generally then, because of these different attributes, are appealing to different stakeholders in terms of who's willing to pay, who's interested in paying, who thinks, well, I'd like to fund that. And part of what the Project Funding Working Group is trying to do is say, all right, for the different kinds of project, both quote big and small, that are under the large umbrella of Python, here are some resources so that you can self-help and say, oh, maybe this funding opportunity would be helpful to me. Maybe this way of thinking about funding would be appropriate to me. And then for really substantial projects that millions of people depend on, like the core of Python itself, like the Python packaging infrastructure and things like that, the Python Software Foundation's Project Funding Working Group started, creating some resources and writing, grant applications and things like that. But now we actually have, as of new this year, at the PSF, a paid full-time staffer, Morgan Mayo, who is going to be working on this stuff for the PSF. And I'm sure that there's probably been some kind of a talk. I haven't looked thoroughly at the PyCon schedule, but I'm sure that somewhere within the PyCon schedule is something where you can hear more about what it is that that this new director of development is doing, right? She comes from the nonprofit fundraising space, right? There's a lot of conversation. There are many resources in to help address the question of how does the industry actually not completely fall down on the job of continuing to feed the goose that lays the golden eggs. right? There is, and there's quite a bit of in the way of resources and help, some of which I help to produce, if you are that goose, right, of where you're looking for feed. So I'm going to share a couple of links in the chat, but yes, this is a matter of ongoing concern. And let me put it this way, there are multiple different startups that are trying to work on this as the main thing they're trying to work on.
Thank you, Sumana. Thank you, May. Carol, so before we end, Carol, you had raised your hand before May. So would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll if I can, I'll share two things. One is thank you, May, for bringing up the issue of burnout. It is real. You know, I had a very toxic startup experience, and I'm also really busy in open source. I now have a wonderful startup experience. However, it took me probably 8 months to kind of feel like, okay, I can even face my email box. You know, and one of the, but you know, yet I was already committed to a bunch of things in the open source world and had to really pick and choose, okay, what fills my cup versus what drains me. I had to really trust the other members of the steering council, Eva and others, to just basically say, I cannot take on anything. I can't even do the commitments that I've already got on my plate. As such, the docs work group took about a year to get off the ground. But, you know, I think taking care of yourself, and I said it before my talk yesterday at the Language Summit, we're in a community where, you know, it's so important, particularly in this past year, to really take care of yourselves. And it is not a failure to take time off or to take a break. For those maintainers that aren't aware, there is a project called Jazz Band that kind of provides stopgap maintainership for projects, which can be a real help, because sometimes if you're like a solo maintainer, you feel the pressure even more because you're like, who's going to take care of this in my absence? So I throw that out there. And then, you know, on the other topic, Sumana, spot on in so many different ways. And I think one thing that I would add, you know, just even beyond the funding, but in terms of building leaders and leadership skills within the community, one of the things that I have found really challenging is if you do the leadership work, like project management or documentation or people management or whatever, you often will hear, but you're not technical, or she's not technical. And it's like, give me an effing break. I could code, I can code. I'm choosing to work on the stuff that has a multiplier effect. And anything we can do to change that cultural perception, Sumana, would be amazing. And just keep writing and keep holding people accountable, because you are so awesome. So thank you, everybody, for putting this together. You are a fabulous group of human beings. Keep doing great work.
Thank you, Carol. A point that I think I make frequently is just open source. In the open source industry, people who particularly want to write functions and classes are overrepresented, right? They're relatively abundant compared to people who have the skills and the interest in doing all the other things that it takes to make software useful and successful. So I can program, I'm going where I'm needed, I'm going where I'm more useful. And, you know, and there's a need for that. So I think that also means we're more valuable in some ways.
Yeah. So any final considerations, everyone?
I just wanted to mention real quick that I do know there are conversations around what Sumana you had brought up internally at GitHub. We're just too early in the conversations to like say something. But I'd say last year during the summer, we did a pilot program with students in particular and getting contributions, basically mentoring them to be contributors on the project. So like sort of like Summer of Code, but with the GitHub umbrella and sort of party planning that we did. So it was like a very small pilot, but it worked.
GitHub's also doing a maintainers summit type thing this year, and it's the first year that I've seen it. So
June 15th, I think. I might got the date wrong.
It's the week of June 7th. Like the whole week of June, like 7th through the 12th is like maintainer week and stuff. I am also speaking at Upstream, which is a Tidelift event that's happening June 7th.
I'll also be speaking there around maintainer hospitality, or sorry, open source hospitality. So it covers a lot of these things.
Okay. So thank you all. I'll popcorn to Inessa.
I just wanted to add to Brian's comment. It's great that GitHub is taking initiative to offer more mentorship. I think we need more of these programs. And thank you so much, everyone who joined us today. Great questions and great answers, truly thought-provoking. Keeping the wheels of open source turning is quite a task. I hope these 2 days of the summit helped you in some way to find answers and solutions to the challenges you face as maintainers. If you haven't already, check out the videos on your YouTube channel. I think we've posted quite a few links, or just go on YouTube and search for Maintainers Summit at PyCon US 2021. Take care of yourself, and if you can, of others too.
Thank you so much.
And I want to thank Inessa and Alex for organizing this and running it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks, Inessa. Thanks, Simona, for the help. Thank you, everyone. It was great.
Yeah, thank you. It's very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Brian, that beer.
Yes, I already followed you on GitHub, which I know doesn't mean a lot of currently, but yes, I will connect with you.
Awesome.
Bye.